Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to our continuation of our case study webinar series. Um, we'll give everyone a few more minutes to jump in. We'll probably start around 10:02, 10:02
Or
Pacific,
two
sorry.
after, yeah, depending on
Yeah,
where you're at.
yeah.
I'm trying to see who's all on board. Let's see.
Yeah.
Not recognizing anybody.
Yeah, we got some new names in here.
Yeah.
We got
I see
Abby.
Abby. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should be a good one today, everybody. We're excited. I'm excited. Great panel. It's gonna be a good one.
Yeah. Very excited to introduce you to our panelists. Um, some big names,
Right.
some big professions. Always excited to have some big names in our on our webinars. All right, folks hopping in.
All
Welcome,
right. Cool.
welcome.
Yeah. Welcome everybody. Nice little amount joining here. Looks like we're
Yeah,
almost ready to go.
yeah, we can go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to or welcome back to our case study webinar series. Today we're focusing on Scope 3 emissions, hot topic in the industry right now. We hope everyone had some restful holidays and is ready to get back in the swing of things. Happy 2024, everyone. A big congratulations to the 3 finalists in the NFL making it to the next round. I just want to mention that 3 out of those 4 finalists are GSA members. Please stick around after the webinar for some quick housekeeping items in regards to our upcoming events. This includes our 2024 Green Sports Alliance Summit, and we'll have some Q&A with our panelists as well. If you have questions throughout this, please enter them into the chat and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. And before we begin, we want to thank our sports screening movement leaders and our Play to Zero partners. Brad, if you can switch the slide. Some of these organizations have supported us for more than a decade, and all of them have been leaders in the sports screening movement. If you're not part of the Alliance and you're looking to join us, you can email me. My email is katie@greensportsalliance.org. If you don't already know me, I am the Associate Manager of Operations, Events, Communications, and Member Services. So any help you need in the Green Sports Alliance, I can definitely be your girl. And if you don't already know, the Green Sports Alliance is a resource and we are a conveyor for sustainable sports. And here is a wider lens of who is in the Alliance now. Switch slides, Brad. We have more than 200 sports and corporate members. We just want to thank everyone up here and everyone on this webinar for supporting our mission to drive sustainable sports. Today, we are going to be focusing on Scope 3 emissions in sports with a unique perspective from a collegiate stadium, a university as a whole, and an emissions professional. We are welcomed by Rich Swanson, the Director of Climate and Energy at Blue Strike Environmental, who's also a Play to Zero partner of the Green Sports Alliance. He is an energy economist and finance specialist by background, and he has spent decades working on the renewable energy transition and climate finance solutions for infrastructure banks, utilities, businesses, and universities. We have Dave Newport from Colorado Boulder. He launched the first nation's zero waste football game at the University of Florida and sold the first sustainability sponsorship as director of the Gators Office of Sustainability. He partnered with CU Boulder's athletics to launch Ralphie's Green Stampede. Dave's consulting team, Phase 3 Sports, wrote the Pac-12's comprehensive sustainability and climate action plan and used across Pac-12 championship events. He also served 2 terms as secretary of the Green Sports Alliance Board of Directors during its startup years. That was 13 years ago. And we have Carlin Hittenmiller. She holds a BA from St. Mary's College of California, where she studied political science. In this time, she also was a member of the Division I soccer team. She's currently attending the University of Colorado Boulder in pursuit of a Master's of the Environment graduate degree. She works with Ralphie's Green Stampede, where she helps track and report carbon emissions to advance the university's sports sustainability goals. And we have Susan Norton, the assistant director within university sustainability practices at Arizona State University. Her key roles include developing and supporting departmental engagement programs, teams, goals, and initiatives. Engagement efforts for the campus include Campus Sustainability Month, Earth Month, Eco Reps, Green Devil Ambassadors, and the Green Commons. The Green Commons, the Sustainability Recognition Program, and the Green Games. Lots of stuff going on there. And Susan manages departmental communications, trainings, and program benchmarking as a part of this role. And now I'll pass it off to Rich, who's going to dive into Scope 3 emissions. You're on mute, Rich.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you to the Green Sports Alliance for the invitation to be here and talk a little bit about Scope 3 emissions. Yeah, very excited to be here and appreciate the invitation. So, Brad, if you could hop to the next slide. As Katie mentioned, we are going to talk about Scope 3 emissions. During my sort of brief segment of the presentation, we'll hit a real quick review of just what scope emissions are and how we talk about emissions in terms of the different categories. Then we'll talk a little bit about characteristics of Scope 3 emissions along with key aspects and the importance of those emissions. We'll talk about the value chain categories. Oftentimes Scope 3 emissions are called value chain emissions. And so we'll talk about the 15 different categories that fall into or fall under that Scope 3 umbrella. And then we'll briefly review 10 steps for setting Scope 3 targets. That would be reduction targets for those types of emissions. So Brad, you can hop to the next slide. So first of all, just understanding scope emissions when we evaluate emissions, and this might be a review for many people, but when we evaluate emissions or do an emissions inventory, we talk about them in 3 scopes. Back 1 slide, Brad, sorry. We talk about them in 3 scopes. Scope 1 is, there we go. Scope 1 are emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the organization itself. And so they result from the organization's operational processes. They might be combustion emissions. Those would be emissions from fuels for heating, for any kind of on-facility power generation, fleet transportation that is owned by the organization, those types of combustible emissions or combustion emissions. And then we also talk about process emissions. This is especially relevant to the manufacturing industry, and it's really emissions that are released in the processing of materials, but it can also come into other organizations. And then fugitive emissions are sort of unintentional releases. Things like refrigerants that leak out when they're being recharged, natural gas leak on site that are happening. Those are fugitive emissions. And so all these fall into scope 1 categories. Scope 2 is from energy that is used by the organization, but it's produced elsewhere. So largely that ends up being purchased electricity. The emissions are coming from a generation site somewhere, and the organization can do a lot to reduce those emissions, but nonetheless, the emissions are being produced someplace else. And hop to the next slide, Brad, if you would please. Scope 3 emissions, by contrast, are not produced directly by the organization, but they are a consequence of its value chain. So they have to do with goods and services being delivered to the organization. And then they also have to do with what's called downstream emissions, or what happens when you take the goods or services that might be produced at the organization and move away or use those goods and services that the organization produces. So often those are the most significant portion of an organization's carbon footprint. Typically, it can be, a third up to 2/3, and perhaps even more, depending on the type of business that the organization is in. Once again, and importantly, these are emissions that are not directly controlled by the organization, and that's going to be a very important point here moving forward. So let's hop to the next slide, Brad. This just sort of summarizes scope 1 emissions are direct emissions. Those are emissions that happen right on the premises of the entity. Scope 2 would be indirect, and those are emissions that are generally, as I mentioned, generation of electricity, and the organization purchases that electricity. And so in that way, they are indirectly responsible for the emissions that are produced at a generation facility. And then third, also indirect. And in this case, scope 3, also indirect emissions. In this case, they are emissions that are incurred in supplying and distributing the goods and services, both used by and sold from the organization. So let's hop to the next slide, Brad. So a couple key aspects of scope 3 emissions. First of all, this idea of upstream activities. These are emissions from the production of goods and services that the organization purchases or acquires. So for a campus, for example, they purchase and acquire food for their food services operations. They acquire books and paper that they sell in their bookstore. They acquire merchandise. And all of those have emissions associated with the manufacturing and transportation of those until they reach the campus. Downstream activities are emissions from the use and end of life treatment of the organization's product and services. And for example, for a university, the categories might not be as filled in from downstream activities, but there are nonetheless some emissions that result from the use of, for example, an education. So we think of out-of-state commuting to and from campus, for example. We could include also sort of end-of-life treatment of merchandise that's purchased on the campus, or of books and paper, and so forth. And then there are other indirect emissions as well. Business travel that is certainly considered, and oftentimes a very big part of scope 3 emissions, depending on the size of the organization. Employee commuting would be considered an indirect and scope 3 emissions category. Leased assets and investments, and we'll get into some of the definitions of some of these here in just a second. So hop to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of these. As I mentioned, it's often the largest share of emissions for an organization. There is a great deal of influence also, particularly for larger organizations, on their supply chain management. Or on their supply chain rather, for their suppliers, people who want to supply to larger organizations. Oftentimes the organization can leverage towards behavior change for those vendors and incentivize the reduction of emissions from other people. And so even though technically not owned by the organization, they often have a significant ability to influence those. Scope 3 emissions are also, it's becoming the norm to measure and report and develop targets just under the banner of corporate responsibility. In addition, the risk management factor is also important as organizations think futuristically about what types of regulations, what types of investment or investor perspective, investors' perspective they might have about the organization and whether or not they should invest there. So this is a big area of sort of corporate responsibility, but also an area of risk management in order for organizations to sort of get ahead of upcoming regulations and public perception. And then lastly, in a similar vein, sort of reputation, developing a competitive advantage in being one of the first movers towards the measurement and target setting of Scope 3 emissions. So let's hop to the next slide. So you'll see here 8 different categories of upstream emissions that fall underneath the Scope 3 umbrella. And I'm just going to walk through these one by one, give a brief description or an example of each one, and then we'll move on to the downstream categories and then finish up with some target setting steps. So the first is purchase goods and services, and I did mention one example of this in a university setting, which would simply be the purchase of food service. So all the food that is purchased by a university like the University of Colorado or Arizona State comes from a vendor, and it has a certain amount of emissions associated with those products that are coming, and those would be fall into this category 1 for Scope 3. The second is capital goods, and capital goods would be larger purchases, for example, buildings, capital products such as fleet, trucks, cars, maybe large equipment. These are large capital investments and again have associated embodied carbon within those purchases that shows up in emissions for this category. So think of the cement and the concrete that is used for building projects. That would be a capital good, and it would be embodied emissions that shows up at your organization, a stadium, a campus, what have you, that has those embodied carbon elements in that capital purchase. The third is fuel and energy related activities, or FARA. These are largely associated with the distribution of natural gas or of electricity, and they come from either leakages upstream, emitting from production, transmission and distribution losses from the electricity company. Fourth, upstream transportation and distribution. This includes anything related to the transportation. For example, transportation even from those category 1 goods and services might fall into this category. There are also some ways of measuring the emissions from those 2 categories, 1 and 4 together, depending on what data is available. Then fifth is waste generated in operations. This is fairly straightforward, but waste that goes into a landfill emits carbon, and so the waste that's generated in that operations would fall into this category as it moves to a landfill. Business travel, we mentioned business travel as one of the categories, employee commuting, other types of commuting, people coming to and from a venue or an event, students coming and going from campus, all those would fall into that category. And then upstream leased assets, these would be leases for office space that a university might have or an organization might have where they're expanding. There's not enough sort of on-campus room, and so offices are leased in other parts nearby or perhaps even in other communities. So those are all the upstream categories that make up Scope 3 emissions. The next slide shows the downstream categories. And these are downstream transportation and distribution. I want to highlight this one for, this would be, for example, people, it could be considered people coming to or going to an event, although that could also be perhaps in the commuting category. But for a university, these downstream transportation issues would involve students coming to campus from out of state, for example, parents flying in. It's anything to do with the use of the service, which in a university's case is education, the need to transport or to arrive at a place, a particular place, to make use of that education. And so that falls into this category. For the rest of these, processing of sold products is largely for those organizations that are producing intermediary goods. The use of sold products, similarly, if your organization is producing things that emit as they're used. End-of-life treatment is an opportunity to think through all goods and services provided and what happens to those downstream lease assets. This would be particularly relevant if your organization is a lessor to others. And then franchises is particularly relevant if you're a franchisor and you are franchising towards your brand or your particular organization around in other geographies. Finally, investments. Investments are Scope 3, particularly for financial institutions who are lending or holding an equity share in another organization that emits. So this would be the investment category. And then, Brad, if we move to the last slide, we'll just look at 10 quick steps to think about for Scope 3 target setting. The first step is really a comprehensive understanding of Scope 3 emissions. The GHG protocol, which many of you are familiar with, provides excellent guidance in their value chain emissions guidance. And so there are step-by-step guides for how to think about where the boundaries of different categories are, minimum boundaries for data collection, and then other optional sort of moving beyond those minimum boundary guidelines. Number two is alignment with global standards in terms of the actual target setting. So the GHG protocol really talks about sort of the inventory part. And then an organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative talks a lot about the target setting aspect. And there are a few elements to keep in mind when thinking about target setting. According to SBTI, if a company's relevant Scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of the total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then setting some sort of a Scope 3 target is required. Furthermore, companies should set targets that collectively cover at least 2/3 of the total Scope 3 emissions, and should consider sort of a minimum boundary as outlined in the GHG protocol's value chain assessment. So there are a few sort of guidance documents that the SBTI puts out, and those are excellent resources for target setting. And then as we go down the list here, setting realistic and achievable goals is important. Engagement with stakeholders. One of the ways to sort of think very broadly about Scope 3 is that they are someone else's Scopes 1 and 2. And so engagement with the owners, quote unquote, of those emissions is really essential in determining strategies for mitigating those emissions. Think about vendors who might be selling something to your organization, partnering with them to the point where they can measure, first of all, their Scopes 1 and 2, then begin the process of reducing those scopes 1 and 2 and 3 potentially. It's important to set both a short-term and a long-term target, and so organizations typically do that. Being inclusive of especially the significant categories and the ones that you retain more control over than other categories. There are some, for example, procurement, in which an organization has a little bit more control, perhaps. And then others, commuting, perhaps that it's a little bit more difficult to rein in those emissions, but focusing certainly on where wins can be attained. The use of intensity and absolute targets, I won't really go into that, but two different kinds of targets that are able to be used and sometimes even in combination. Regular review and adjustment, at least, on a frequent basis, so that new inventories and new strategies can be created. Transparency and accountability is essential for Scope 3 emissions, being as sort of as much full disclosure as possible in how those emissions are calculated, what the intent is moving forward, and then what the plans for reducing those emissions moving forward. And obviously, innovation and improvement in each of these areas is a big focus. There's just no way to snap one's fingers and magically make Scope 3 emissions go away by any stretch. And so this is an area that is continually evolving with policies, with technology, incentives that organizations have to continue to try to measure, assess, forecast, and eventually come up with strategies for reducing those emissions. And then finally, the last slide is simply just to conclude and say thanks, and to turn it back over to Katie and the other panelists. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. And now we're going to hear from the University of Colorado Boulder, and they're going to dive into the athletics department. And here's Dave.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm joined by Carly Hittenmiller here, who's also going to come back into viewing. And we're going to quickly tag team a little bit of the stuff that we're doing here at CU with respect to this issue. And also thank Rich for the great setup and backgrounder on Scope 3. And just to be transparent, enjoy working closely with Rich and Blue Stripe, who are developing our climate action plan and climate justice plan comprehensively for the whole university at this time. And that's been a learning experience for all of us, mostly me learning from Rich. So moving forward, just a background very quickly, our athletics department has been very proactive in leading the conversation about sports sustainability at the collegiate level. We are the first NCAA Division I program in the nation to offer a comprehensive sustainability approach, which we'll detail a little bit more about later on. Part of that was to build into the built environment many of the attributes of sustainability that we could land on the ground that deliver recurring and ongoing reductions in all scopes of carbon emissions and so forth. And you see in that little picture there at the bottom left, a large building with a big array on both sides of that is the first net zero energy athletics facility in the United States, and actually produces more electricity and total energy actually than it consumes, and helps power that building, which is LEED Platinum, and two adjacent buildings that you also see in the picture there next to the stadium are part of the comprehensive approach to construction on campus, where the athletics department actually has more platinum buildings than any other department on campus. We've tried to also attack vigorously, and we've been the waste stream, going to zero waste, going to really try to propagate less materials go into the landfill by moving to aluminum, reducing plastic consumption and so forth, and winning a lot of awards and competitions for basically the best recycling rates and zero waste rates in the Pac-12 over the last 12 or 13 years. There'll be a link to that later on. If we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about some of our approaches. One, of course, is the first university to sign the UN Sports for Climate Action Framework, which is a very robust goal-setting program and annual reporting program that bundles with the Race to Zero, also a UN product. And now, along with 6 universities, have signed on, 6 universities in the United States, to champion this and really accelerate what we are doing through sports and tell that story, and quite frankly translate that also into enterprise, and that we have through that effort and our ongoing effort brought in a lot of brands to support directly our sustainability work. Several $million worth of brands have supported us. And we're proud to work with some of the esteemed campuses that are also doing this, but we've got to accelerate. We're also part of the founding fabric of the Pac-12 Team Green, which for another 3 or 4 months is still in existence, while the Pac-12 is still in existence. But brought together all of the athletics departments of the Pac-12 conference, first aggregation of the entire sports community in a collegiate sports enterprise to accelerate this. Our friends at Arizona State obviously are also members and have done great work. And we hope to move this now as, again, CU and ASU are both moving to the Big 12. We're going to green up the Big 12. Moving on to last slide, and just to follow up on Rich's presentations, and this is actually Rich's graphic, but we mirror this. So we did the scope 3, and the we being Carly and Angie and Abby and Robin, who are also on this call as viewers today, broke out the scope 3 fraction that was attributable to the athletics department. She's going to tell you more about that in these upstream categories that are indicated, and we will abide by the targets that we are setting as a campus to try and mitigate those over time. So Carly's going to tell you a little bit about how that works, and I'm going to pass the baton to Carly, and I'll see you back in a minute.
Great, thank you. If we could go to the next slide. Great, so creating a scope 3 carbon inventory and implementing actual reductions is a significant undertaking for a university of CU's size and anyone in general. So benchmarking is a key part of this process. This began in 2019 when we chose 2019 as our emissions baseline year and highlighting the scope 3 areas for future attention. Also in 2019, CU Athletics and Ralphie's Grand Stampede, our sports sustainability team, signed the UN Sports for Climate Action Pledge, which Dave mentioned. So this reports all of our emissions to the UN, and it's been a great starting point for us to organize the necessary data to create a scope 3 inventory, and it has also allowed us to see where our gaps are. Last year, in 2023, we resubmitted to the UN Sports for Climate Action Pledge and revisited our baseline carbon inventory, which was 2019, due to a bunch of new data availability, and then we were able to compare this with our 2022 inventory. From this, we learned that travel and purchasing are our biggest scope 3 categories. So using this information, we've seen that procurement will be a major part of our future steps. So in the coming years, our ultimate goal is to create a decarbonization strategy with suppliers to decrease emissions, develop new procurement methods, and achieve our emissions reduction target of 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And next slide, please. So now I'm going to dive a little bit more into our methodology and what it actually takes to create a scope 3 carbon inventory. So I'll be talking about data sources, verification processes, emission factors, and calculation methods. So to begin, we use the GHG protocol spend-based method for our Scope 3 calculations. This means that our results are educated estimates rather than the exact numbers that can be produced by Scope 1 and 2 calculations. As many of us know, the evolving science around Scope 3 is always changing and finding ways to be more accurate, but for the time being, we are dealing with the emission factors and data that we have available, but the accuracy of our Scope 3 emissions will expand over time to include more categories as adequate data becomes available. But currently, our data collection methods are really at a great place. Receiving raw data to create our inventory was a relatively streamlined process due to pre-existing partnerships within the university. So collecting data was not a significant challenge for us. Our data sources include things like documents and invoices, utility charges from facilities management, credit card, financial data from athletics and procurement, and waste data from the Environmental Center Zero Waste team. So with all this data, which was a very significant amount, we decided to draw our inventory boundaries at the upstream consumption level due to a lack of downstream data at this point. And for emission factors, we used an internal third-party emission factor database that has been used in all of our previous GHG accounting projects, as well as the EPA Emission Factors Hub, which is a great resource to supplement emission factors in Scope 3 inventories. Now, looking at methods, we used the same methods as our university's climate action plan, where the majority of our Scope 3 categories were calculated using the operational control and spend-based methods, as I already mentioned. Obviously, since financial data and about owned assets was the most prevalent for us. But with all these processes coming together, we feel like we've made significant strides in understanding our impact and how to create more efficient data management operating procedures so these methodologies can be replicated for future use. And next slide, please. So from all of this, what does it tell us? We found that in 2022, Scope 3 made up almost 70% of all of CU athletics emissions, which didn't come as a surprise, but it is still a shocking number once it's calculated. So based on the availability of data, we are able to include the categories of purchased goods and services, fuel and energy related activities, waste generated in operations, business travel, and upstream leased assets. And you can see as this graph on the right depicts the spread of these categories, and we can obviously see that travel and purchased goods and services make up quite a significant amount. And next slide, please. So comparing this to our baseline, our 2019 baseline was created with the same methodologies that I earlier described, and it also includes the same Scope 3 categories as 2022. And from this, we can see that Scope 3 emissions have increased since 2019, but more importantly, our overall emissions have decreased by a total of 8% due to changes in Scope 1 and 2 consumption, which is a great starting point for just seeing emissions decrease over time, which is our ultimate goal. But looking at our Scope 3 increase, we can attribute this to more attendance at sporting events post-COVID and an increase in procurement data availability. But looking to the future, changes are difficult to predict due to an upcoming conference change that will be taking place next year, and increases in football attendance, which happened during our 2023 football season. But CU is taking the necessary steps to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, and with that, I'll pass it back to Dave.
And we can move on to the next slide. We'll try and close this thing out and get some time left for Susan. Just want to touch on a few of the things that we're seeking to do and have been doing going forward. Obviously, the aspect of the built environment sometimes gets overlooked in terms of Scope 3 contribution. But again, with the ANFED now that has actually come out of the University of Colorado's research process, green cement that has low, if not zero, depending on how you want to calculate it, carbon embedded in it. We hope to move our building construction practices and so forth into a position where we can use that. There's 7 retail establishments now in the state of Colorado that have green cement available, and obviously everyone uses a lot of that. That is of global emitters. Cement processing is one of the biggest contributors there is to global climate change. Building it into your built environment helps you on scope 3, helps the planet, of course. Along the way, we have moved the campus to a toxin-free campus turf position. That's also in athletics, where we don't use synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. We nurture the turf by using compost tea that's broadcast out through our irrigation system. There's an exception to that, unfortunately, for our football stadium. When they have concerts, we have to cover the football field with floor, and unfortunately we have to put a small amount of fungicide underneath that. But with that exception, we're pretty much toxin free, and of course that reduces carbon in the supply chain there. Water restoration credits kind of goes along with our housing weatherization, which you'll see the water conservation practices noted in our facilities, in our bathrooms, and so forth. We try to do a lot of fan engagement around water conservation. We've had a vendor that supported us for years in purchasing water restoration credits that actually physically restored water to the Colorado River Basin and so forth. And we were able to use that to help balance out our water consumption and the carbon that comes with that. Plastics reductions, can't say enough about that. Our team, as I just mentioned, are here today, and they just work their tails off, period. Crazy big 85-90% diversion rates out of every football game takes a stupid amount of work, and these folks get out there and make that happen, and that goes straight to scope 3 and so forth. Their recycling rates are fabulous. I'll finish this out in a second. And just to mention, car-free tailgate is also a place where we hope to minimize fan travel to and from games. And bus and bike access, again, trying to minimize fan travel to games as well. I will tell you that we have not got our arms around team travel and fan travel to the extent that we're going to have to, and that is coming. Fan travel being the sort of the elephant in the room here in terms of what we're going to do about it. Moving to the last slide I've got, if you would, Brad, thank you. Supply chain purchasing plan. This is a place where things get murky, and there's different approaches to this. I've sampled a couple here. Just regular purchasing. You can see some of the practices through Amazon that they're recommending. EcoVadis is one of the top consulting firms in the world that is really trying to get a very analytical assay of the carbon, and you see these other qualities, labor and human rights, ethics, environmental impacts, sustainability, procurement, into ratings of vendors where you can use those services to select certain suppliers over others based on what medal they've won. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, is preparing analytical data. And it's very interesting to go back to what Rich said at the beginning in terms of corporate responsibility. This very analytical and empirical data from CDP is spawned by the investors in 600 major brands who are worried about the downside risk that they have of buying into a carbon-laced supply chain, and have sent to these brands, hey, we need these data and you're going to help us put them together. So CDP has been working on that. And so over time, we're going to have a much more robust and analytical and go-to resource. Right now, it is difficult to find a way to really get a hold of this. And so we sort of do categorical purchasing reductions like I'm envisioning here to try and mitigate. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Susan so that we can hear all the great stuff that our First Stars Platinum School in the Pac-12 has offered. I'll pass to Susan at ASU.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Happy to be here. So jumping in really quick, agenda commitment from president of our university for sustainable practices. I'll briefly touch on what we are doing with scope 1, 2, and 3, and then discuss some of the challenges with scope 3. Next slide. So achieving carbon neutrality at ASU, Dr. Crow pledged carbon neutrality for scopes 1 and 2 by 2025, and then scope 3 by 2035. He was one of the original signatories of the ACU PCC commitment. We re-signed this commitment. He re-signed in 2015 as well. We were able to achieve carbon neutrality 6 years early with building retrofits, solar additions across all of our campuses, the purchase of renewable energy certificates, and of course, offsets. Next slide. So with regards to scope 1 emissions, our direct emissions, we took on this challenge with our first GHG inventory in 2007. With this information, we were able then to be able to kind of roadmap out our next steps for reduction. As mentioned before, we did significant retrofitting of our buildings and implementing as much solar on campus pretty much as possible. Our rooftop solar is extensive. Pretty much every rooftop that we have available has a solar system, functioning solar system. We have 90 solar systems across our campuses. We were also the first in the nation to utilize the Power Parasol solar systems. We have 3 of these parasols. They are basically cover key walkways or mall areas within our campus or large parking structures. They're more of an architectural kind of system. They're 25 feet tall and allow for various lighting and actually even advertisement on the pillars. This is especially kind of pertinent outside of our Gamage auditorium, where we're able to utilize these structures for obviously renewable energy, but also provides amazing shade on our mall areas during the hot months. And again, marketing for Gamage or Broadway shows, things of this nature. Next slide. So scope 2 are purchased energy. Some of our big projects are kind of a project with the Red Rock Solar project with APS, one of our energy companies. They constructed the solar field and we've agreed to buy this energy for at least the next 20 years. Another one would be the Salt River project at Central Line Solar Site. Again, another project where they build and we purchase the energy. ASU, in addition to 21 large companies and or schools purchased from this site as well. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, there we go. Okay, scope 3 projects. I'm going to kind of just jump into some of the projects that we're working on or we've been successful with regards to scope 3. A big one is our travel fee price on carbon. We implemented this starting 2011, so this has sort of been a work in progress. It was an opt-in program for many years, and 2019, it's become a mandatory program at ASU. There's an $18 fee added to all round-trip flights to offset emissions. The fees go into the carbon project account, and then we utilize the fees to fund local projects. Again, all university staff, study abroad students, and athletics are assessed this fee. We, again, really, it's a lucrative amount of money. During COVID, obviously, we dropped, but we currently kind of back to where we were, and it's been a very good project. Next slide. Another one of our projects is our shared fleet EV vehicle pilot. We currently launched this for just our business services unit. This is again a shared fleet, and with the hopes are to get everybody into EV vehicles and sharing across the university. So far, we've been very successful. This has been in place for about 6 to 8 months, and we are currently looking at expansion with other departments and other universities, other campuses within ASU. Next slide. With regards to employee commute, our latest survey shows progress. This is exciting. We've hit our goal. Original goal was to reduce single occupancy vehicle travel to below 60%. We're currently at 59%. And so obviously our commuters to campus are choosing alternative means. And I know that, certainly work from home opportunities have helped with this. Another project we currently have going are our purchase goods and services scorecard project. We are currently kicking this off with the procurement department. Applies to over 400 suppliers. Focus on qualitative results and carbon intensity of those companies. Next slide. So some of our challenges with Scope 3, these are pretty universal to other universities and other entities for sure. But the size of our campus alone and the amount of students we have is huge. 79,000 in-person students on campus, 5,000 faculty, 18,000 staff members. We are continuing to expand our footprint with regards to other campuses, even out-of-state campuses. And, we're always looking to increase the capacity of our students on campus as well. Balancing meaningful projects just with the cost of a public institution, and of course, always being aware of the scrutiny and with the quality of offsets that we've purchased. We are currently kind of looking into maybe other opportunities with regards to this. Again, just showing our numbers. Multiple campuses in and out of state. Our main campus is landlocked, so with regards to adding other renewables, we really can't build other solar systems. And our vendor contracts don't always allow for immediate change. Next slide. Next slide. And then, quickly, some of the attributes of our stadium with our renovation 2 to 3 years ago. Currently, over 250 compost and recycling bins only. There's no landfill. We've got our zero waste refillable cup, $25 for the whole season. Refill as much as you like. Move to digital ticketing. We're LEED Gold rating with our renovation. Strategic tree planting and all of the walkways, light-colored concrete in exposed areas, reflective roofing. 30% of our total energy cost is generated from our Stadium Drive parking structure solar system. And again, 63% of the wood used is FSC certified, low-emitting paints, sealants used, and EV charging stations throughout the stadium. We currently actually have over 171 charging stations campus-wide, even outside of the stadium. And that's it for ASU.
All right.
Thank you so much, Susan. I know we're a little bit short on time. We want to get to your guys' questions. Do just want to mention that we have a couple playbooks coming out. If you guys are interested in getting involved, we have one on reuse and one on energy. And you can email Michael Kraus, who's on our team, and Brad can put his email in the chat if you want to get involved. And a couple of events we have coming up. We have another webinar on February 7th. And of course, we have our annual summit happening in June. We are almost ready to tell our location and dates, but please follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter. That should be coming out in either a week or two. We're also going to put out a call for speakers. So if you or your organization has something really fun to say, if you have a hot topic that you want to talk about, please submit the form and we will get in contact with you. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to sit and chat with us. And I'll pass it to Brad for some questions.
Yeah. So I'd love to invite the panelists back on for a quick round of Q&A. We had a lot of great questions coming in through the presentations. Really, I think the biggest takeaway from everything I saw was supply chain, and then travels, which does seem pretty common for a lot of the sports world at this point. So very interesting to see kind of that kind of look into kind of the supply chain, because that was very common between the two of you. But one question for CU from Sai Chang from 3R Sustainability: does CU publish its athletic department greenhouse gas inventory publicly?
Answer to that is yes. The UN Sports for Climate Action Framework requires annual public reporting. All of the participating organizations are doing so, and that amounts to about 400 global sports organizations, from FIFA and UEFA on down to the Spanish soccer club, all manner of. And so, yeah, they're all there, and transparency and really keeping tabs of this is one of the hallmarks of the UN's approach to this.
Yeah. And then another question is, how are the ASU Scope 3 initiatives, this is for Susan, obviously, being funded? So all the initiatives around Scope 3 reductions, what are the main funding mechanisms currently?
The main funding that I would say they're kind of departmental. So like with regards to fleet, our shared fleet, that is basically funded within business services.
Okay, so when is it for the people on the phone or on the presentation? Can you explain what business services are, just to make sure everyone knows?
Okay, so right, business services is just anything like that like risk management, the sustainability office, health and safety, anything that is necessary. It's almost to keep the university running. So we are under the CFO of the university, and then a direct line to the president's office. So it's anything outside of an academic department that contributes, the bookstore, any of those things that help keep the university running for students, staff, and faculty.
Okay. Yeah, and one final thing that just sticks with me is when you guys mentioned the conference realignment piece of all of this, because CU, you were able to reduce your, scope 1 and 2, and now all of a sudden they're just going to throw in this new conference realignment and say, all right, here you go, let's travel all the way to the East Coast for things like this. So it doesn't seem like it's very prevalent in the kind of conference, world in football. I guess more of just an observation more than a question, but as this is a panel about sustainability, and like you said, it is the elephant in the room right now around kind of fan travel and all that whole piece. So again, just overall, it's just a weird world, this sports and sustainability kind of sector. But I mean, one thing I think we can highlight is the scope 1 and 2 reductions. Those aren't as much of a wild west of tracking. So really, if you're not tracking scope 1 and 2 to the degree and level you could, you're missing a big opportunity here, because those are where you can really make tangible reductions. And then especially when it comes to operational costs and things like that, you can see those costs start to reduce. But then, yeah, as a whole, scope 3 is just a crap show, for lack of a better word, of everything. So thank you so much, everyone, for your deep dive into this. I think everyone who was on the panel or was able to attend today was able to get at least a better understanding of kind of how scope 3 is approached. And really, I think we understand that it's not, there isn't a great definition. We do have some good insights, but for the sports world, it is just gnarly kind of endeavor. So with that, thank you so much. Katie, do you have anything to wrap us up with?
If you guys are open to it, there's a question for Rich, if you guys can stay on for an extra minute or so. Rich, for leased assets, does that include all associated emissions of the leased building? Or is there a difference between control and equity? By David from Project Next.
Yeah, so the control versus equity, breakdown or perspective is a choice one can make when reporting emissions. So whether your organization has a particular control or whether they own some sort of share or whatever, and it has to do with some of the different categories, even within scope 3, and it plays a part certainly in investments and so forth. When determining leased assets, if you're talking about upstream leased assets, that's mostly going to be, my understanding is it's mostly going to be scopes 1 and 2 of the sort of energy use agreements for the office space that you lease. And if you're talking about downstream leased assets, then then you're, of course, if you're leasing out, a lot of those assets or a lot of those emissions are associated with scopes 1 and 2 because you own the property, but then the use that is incurred by the lease, the person who has the lease, the emissions there would be part of that scope 3 aspect category. So yeah, not sure if I fully answered that question, but that's a little bit about leased assets up and downstream.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if anyone wants to get a hold of Rich, I just put his email in the chat. He is a master at these things, so he can definitely help you out with any questions.
Yeah. And then overall, we're at time, everyone. So thank you so much for our panelists. Thank you for everyone who attended. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and keep fighting the good fight. We need people like y'all. So please keep fighting the good fight.